For years, I was rejected by my wife's family. They called my work an adult plaything and ignored me at every dinner. I never responded with anger. I just watched in silence. When I came back different, with proof, it was already too late. I met Margaret at a photography exhibition at the community center. I was displaying some of my first woodworking pieces, small carved boxes and ornaments I had created in my makeshift workshop in the garage. She stopped in front of my booth, gently touching a jewelry box that I had spent weeks carving. "This is truly extraordinary," she said, her blue eyes shining with genuine admiration. "You made this with your own hands." That moment changed my life. Margaret was sophisticated, intelligent, and came from a traditional Connecticut family, the Hartwells. Her father, Richard, was a respected corporate attorney, and her mother, Eleanor, organized charity events for the local elite. They had educated their 3 daughters at private schools and expected them all to pursue an appropriate careers and marry men from the same social circle. I was none of those things. The son of a mechanic and a nurse, I had dropped out of college in my sophomore year to follow my passion for woodworking. I worked as a carpenter during the day and spent evenings and weekends developing my own creations. It was honest work that I loved deeply. We married after a year of dating. Margaret believed in me, in my talent, in my vision of someday having my own fine woodworking studio. The wedding was small, just a few close friends and family. I immediately noticed how Richard and Eleanor barely made eye contact with me during the ceremony. Margaret's sisters, Caroline and Elizabeth, exchanged glances whenever I spoke. "They just need time," Margaret assured me on our wedding night. "Dad is old-fashioned. He expected me to marry a lawyer or doctor." The first Sunday dinner at the Hartwells established the pattern for the years to come. The imposing colonial house with white columns and immaculate gardens seemed to assess and judge me before I even entered. "So, Thomas," Richard said as he cut his roast beef, Margaret mentions you're a carpenter." "Actually, I'm a woodworker. I specialize in handcrafted pieces and custom furniture," I replied, trying to keep the pride in my voice. "Fascinating," he responded, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "And that pays the bills," Eleanor interjected. "Richard, please. Thomas is just exploring his options. I'm sure he'll eventually find something more substantial." Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. "Thomas is talented. You should see what he creates." "Hobbies are important," Caroline said with a condescending smile. "My husband collects vintage cars. It's adorable how men need these playthings." "It's not a hobby," I replied calmly. "It's my profession and passion." The silence that followed was deafening. In the weeks and months that followed, the pattern repeated itself. At every family gathering, my work was consistently referred to as your little project, that thing you do in the garage, or your adult plaything. Gifts I meticulously crafted for birthdays or Christmas were received with forced smiles and quickly set aside. During a baby shower for Elizabeth, I accidentally overheard Eleanor talking with a friend in the kitchen. "Poor Margaret, she has so much potential, but she chose to marry that craftsman. He didn't even finish college, you know. Works with his hands, coming home covered in sawdust. Imagine what our friends think." I swallowed the lump in my throat and quietly returned to the living room. On our second Christmas together, Margaret gave me a present she clearly thought would be perfect, an expensive tie for you when you start interviewing for real jobs. She didn't realize how much that hurt, how she had begun to absorb her family's view of my work. Our small but charming apartment transformed into a silent battlefield. Margaret began working overtime at her executive assistant job, often coming home late after drinks with colleagues that I suspected included her family. One night, after a particularly difficult Thanksgiving dinner, where I was effectively ignored for 3 hours, Margaret and I had our first major fight. "They're my family, Thomas. What do you expect me to do?" she shouted, tears in her eyes. "I expect you to stand up for me just once," I replied, my voice breaking. "You sit there while they treat my work, my passion, as some kind of joke, like I'm less than a man because I create things with my hands." "You're overreacting," she said, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. "They just worry about our financial future." I sold my first significant piece that same month, a custom dining table for a local upscale restaurant. I was proud, excited to share the news. When I mentioned it at the next family gathering, Richard smiled coldly. "Good for you finding someone to buy one of your creations. How suitable a wooden table is for a high-class restaurant." "I couldn't say." Caroline laughed. "I hope they checked if it's level." I said nothing, just watched as Margaret smiled uncomfortably. She shrugged at me later, as if to say, "What can I do?" That night, lying beside my wife who was pretending to sleep, I made a decision. I would no longer seek this family's approval. I wouldn't beg for the respect I deserved. Instead, I would channel all this pain and rejection into my work. If they would never truly see me, at least I would see myself clearly. The next day, I found a small shop to rent. I invested all our savings in it, without consulting Margaret. When she found out, her face went pale. "You did what? How are we supposed to pay for that? Thomas, this is insane." "I can't go on like this, Margaret," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "Either you believe in me, like you said you did when we met, or you don't. But I can't keep living being diminished and ignored by your family while you watch in silence." That night, she slept at her parents' house, sitting alone in our empty apartment, surrounded by sketches of my dreams. I wondered if our marriage would survive. But more than that, I wondered if I could survive if I continued to live in the shadow of their contempt. Something had to change. I needed to change. What I didn't know at the time was that this decision would mark just the beginning of a journey that would test every part of me: my marriage, my craft, my very perception of worth. The rejection I had felt for years was about to transform into something none of the Hartwells could have predicted. And when they finally saw the truth about me, about my work, it would be too late to turn back. Margaret returned 3 days later. She entered our apartment quietly, her eyes red from crying. I was sketching at the kitchen table, designs for pieces I would create in my new workshop space. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. "I talked to my parents," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They think I should leave you." The words hung in the air between us. I put down my pencil, feeling an odd sense of calm despite the storm raging inside me. "And what do you think?" I asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to leave you, Thomas. I love you. But I'm scared. This shop, all our savings. What if it doesn't work?" "Then I'll have tried and failed doing something I believe in," I said simply. "Instead of living half a life, trying to please people who will never accept me." That night, we reached an uneasy truce. Margaret would give me 6 months with the shop. If I couldn't make it profitable by then, I would look for more stable employment. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. The following Sunday, we arrived at the Hartwell mansion for the usual family dinner. The tension was palpable as Richard opened the door, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Margaret, darling," Eleanor cooed, embracing her daughter while barely acknowledging my presence. "You look tired. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Mom," Margaret replied, squeezing my hand, a small gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by her father. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, on a massive mahogany table that had been in the Hartwell family for generations. I couldn't help but notice the crude joinery at the corners, a detail that would have been simple to improve with proper craftsmanship. "We've invited someone special tonight," Eleanor announced as we settled in. "Dr. James Peterson. He's just joined Richard's firm as their corporate counsel. Brilliant young man, Harvard Law." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. I watched as James was welcomed into the fold with enthusiasm that had never been extended to me. Tall, polished, with the easy confidence of someone who's never questioned their place in the world, he was everything the Hartwells wanted in their circle. "James, this is Margaret's husband, Tom," Richard introduced me dismissively. In Thomas, I corrected quietly. Thomas Miller. Thomas is a carpenter, Caroline added with a smirk. Woodworker, I clarified, though no one seemed to hear. How interesting, James responded with rehearsed politeness. My grandfather used to whittle as a hobby. He made the most darling little animal figures. I nodded, swallowing the desire to explain the vast difference between hobby whittling and the fine woodworking I pursued. It wouldn't matter. It never did. Throughout dinner, I was effectively rendered invisible. The conversation flowed around me, talk of the country club, Richard's cases, Eleanor's charity functions, James's promising career. Margaret occasionally tried to include me, but her attempts fell flat against the wall of indifference. Thomas has just opened his own workshop, she mentioned during a lull in conversation. Oh. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. How enterprising. It's just a small space, I added, determined to show some enthusiasm despite the chill. In the room. But it will allow me to take on larger custom projects and display some pieces. And you're financing this. Venture how exactly? Richard asked, his tone making it clear he already knew the answer. Before I could respond, Margaret jumped in. We've been saving Dad. This is important to Thomas. I see. Richard exchanged a meaningful look. With Eleanor. Well, I hope this hobby shop doesn't put too much strain on your household. Margaret deserves stability. It's not a hobby shop, I said firmly, meeting his gaze, and I'm perfectly capable of providing for my wife. An uncomfortable silence descended over the table. Elizabeth, who had been quiet until now, clearly decided to change the subject. James, did Margaret tell you she was top of her class at Wellesley? She had offers from several prestigious firms before she decided to take time off. The implication was clear. Margaret had sacrificed her potential for me. I glanced at my wife, wondering if she saw it too, if she agreed. Her face was unreadable as she stared down at her plate. After dinner, the men were invited to Richard's study for brandy. I was technically included, though it was clear my presence was merely tolerated. The study was a shrine to masculine success as defined by men like Richard. Leather-bound books, hunting trophies, photographs with influential figures. So, Thomas, James said, clearly trying to make polite conversation, what made you choose woodworking? I considered deflecting, giving a simple answer, but something in me refused to diminish my passion any longer. The first time I transformed a piece of raw wood into something useful and beautiful, I felt a connection to something ancient and honorable, I said. There's an integrity to it. You can't hide flaws in woodworking. The material demands honesty and patience. Every piece carries the mark of its maker. James looked genuinely interested, but Richard cut in with a dismissive wave. Yes, and very philosophical. Meanwhile, the real world runs on contracts and connections, not wooden trinkets. He turned to James. Margaret had such promise. Full scholarship to law school at Yale. But she deferred and then, well, he gestured vaguely in my direction. The implication was like a knife between my ribs. I was the reason Margaret had abandoned her potential, the reason she wasn't living the life her family had planned. I excused myself, needing air. On the porch, I found Margaret deep in conversation with her mother. They fell silent when they saw me, but not before I caught the end of Eleanor's sentence. Duh. Not too late to reconsider your options, darling. The drive home was silent. When we arrived at our apartment, Margaret went straight to bed without a word. I stayed up late, working on designs for my first pieces in the new shop, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of cold coffee. Why didn't you tell me about Yale? I asked quietly. She looked up, surprised. What? Your father mentioned you had a full scholarship. To Yale Law. You never told me. Margaret sighed, pushing her hair back from her face. It wasn't relevant. I had already decided not to go before I met you. Why? Because I wasn't sure it was what I wanted. My whole life was planned out by my parents. The right school, the right career, the right husband. Meeting you was the first time I made a choice for myself. Her eyes met mine, vulnerable and honest. You think you're the only one who feels judged by them. I've never lived up to their expectations either. It was a moment of connection I hadn't expected. For the first time, I saw Margaret not just as my wife or as a Hartwell, but as someone caught between worlds, just like me. The following weeks were a blur of activity as I set up my shop. I named it Miller Fine Woodworking, and spent every waking hour either working on inventory or trying to make connections with local designers and businesses. Margaret helped when she could, creating a simple website and business cards. Yet despite these small steps forward, the shadow of the Hartwells' disapproval followed us. Margaret was invited to family events where I was conspicuously not included. Phone calls from her mother always seemed to end with Margaret looking worried and distracted. One evening, I came home to find Margaret on the phone, her voice hushed but angry. "No, Mom, I won't ask him that, because it's humiliating. You know, we're managing fine." When she saw me, she quickly ended the call. "Just Mom being Mom," she said with a forced smile. "What didn't you want to ask me?" I questioned, setting down my tool bag. Margaret hesitated. They offered to pay our rent for a few months, if you would consider a position at Dad's firm, in their maintenance department. The offer was so insulting it almost made me laugh. Almost. They'd rather have me as the office handyman than a woodworker trying to build his own business. "They're worried about us, Thomas, about our finances." "Are you?" I asked, searching her face. "Are you worried?" She didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "The shop hasn't made money yet," she finally said, "and our savings are almost gone." "I need more time," I insisted. "The Davidson commission is almost complete, and that will bring in enough to cover next month's expenses. And the month after that, and after that." Margaret's voice rose. "I believe in your talent, Thomas, I do, but I'm also scared. Every time the phone rings, I'm afraid it's another bill collector." "I never asked you to live in fear," I said quietly. "And if you want out, just say so." "That's not what I want," she cried. "I want us to succeed, together. But sometimes I feel like you're so focused on proving my family wrong that you're not seeing how this affects us, affects me." Her words hit home harder than she knew. Was I pushing forward with my dream out of passion or out of spite? The line had blurred somewhere along the way. That night, as Margaret slept beside me, I made a silent promise. Not to her family, but to her and to myself. I would make this work, not to prove the Hartwells wrong, but to create the life Margaret deserved, a life where she wouldn't have to choose between her husband and her family. What I didn't realize then was how deeply the wounds of rejection had already cut into the foundation of our marriage, invisible fissures that would only widen with time and pressure. The Hartwells had planted seeds of doubt, not just in Margaret's mind, but in mine as well, and those seeds were beginning to take root in dangerous ways. The following weekend, we were invited to Elizabeth's son's first birthday party. I suggested skipping it, given the tension, but Margaret insisted we should go. "They're still my family, Thomas," she said, "and I want them to see that we're okay, that we're strong." I agreed, for her sake. But as I prepared a special gift, a hand-carved wooden train set that had taken me weeks to perfect, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into another battlefield, one where I was already defeated before the first shot was fired. What I couldn't have known was that this birthday party would become the catalyst for a turning point in our story, one that would force every unspoken tension into the harsh light of day. Elizabeth's sprawling Tudor home was decorated elaborately for little Henry's first birthday. Blue and white balloons adorned every corner, and a professional photographer captured each moment of the celebration. When we arrived, Margaret's shoulders tensed as Eleanor approached us with a tight smile. "Margaret, darling, we were beginning to think you wouldn't make it." Her eyes flickered briefly to me, then to the wooden box in my hands. "Oh, you've brought something." I forced a smile. "A handmade train set for Henry." How unique, Eleanor replied. The gift table is over there, though I must warn you, Henry already has quite a collection of toys from FAO Schwartz. As I placed my carefully crafted gift among the professionally wrapped packages, I noticed Caroline watching me, whispering something to her husband that made him chuckle. The familiar sting of exclusion washed over me, but I pushed it aside for Margaret's sake. The party proceeded as expected. I found myself alone by the refreshment table while Margaret was pulled into family photographs and conversations. I watched her across the room, laughing with her sisters, momentarily free from the tension that had become a constant presence in our home. Not much of a mingler, are you? I turned to find James Peterson beside me, 2 glasses of scotch in hand. He offered one to me. Not when no one wants to mingle with me, I replied honestly, accepting the drink. James nodded thoughtfully. The Hartwells can be traditional in their views. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing takes courage, following your passion despite the obstacles. His unexpected support caught me off guard. Thank you, I said, unsure if he was being sincere or setting me up for another subtle humiliation. I mean it, he continued. Most men I know are trapped in careers they hate because they're too afraid to risk security for fulfillment. Before I could respond, Richard's booming voice called for everyone's attention. Time for presents. We gathered around as Elizabeth helped Henry open his gifts. Expensive toys, designer clothes, and a savings bond from Richard and Eleanor that would give him a proper start in life. When my wooden train set was unwrapped, there was a moment of awkward silence. What is it? Someone asked. It's a wooden train set, Elizabeth explained, examining it without enthusiasm. From Thomas and Margaret. It's handcrafted, Margaret added quickly. Thomas made it specially for Henry. Well, isn't that thoughtful? Elizabeth said, already reaching for the next gift. The train set was hastily set aside, forgotten among the more impressive presents. I felt Margaret's hand slip into mine, a silent apology. But when I looked at her, I saw something else in her eyes, embarrassment. She was embarrassed by my gift, by me. That realization hit harder than any direct insult from the Hartwells ever could. As the party continued, I excused myself to get some air. The backyard was immaculate, with manicured gardens and a stone patio where a few guests were chatting. I found a quiet corner and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm building inside me. Quite the production for a 1-year-old, who won't remember any of it, a voice said. I turned to find Elizabeth's husband, Robert, lighting a cigar nearby. It's more for the adults than for Henry, I replied. Robert laughed. You've got that right. The Hartwells never miss. An opportunity for a display. He offered me a cigar, which I declined. You know, Thomas, I've been where you are, the outsider trying to fit into this family. Does it ever get easier? I asked. He took a long drag of his cigar. You learn to play the game. I pretend to care about Richard's golf stories and Eleanor's charity causes, and in return, they pretend I'm good enough for their daughter. He lowered his voice. Between us, Elizabeth's trust fund makes it worth the occasional dinner of listening to Richard pontificate. His cynical perspective should have made me feel better. At least I wasn't alone in feeling like an outsider. Instead, it left me cold. Was this what my future held? Years of pretending, of compromising my dignity for occasional peace? As I pondered this, I overheard voices from the nearby garden shed. The door was slightly ajar, and Richard's distinctive tone carried clearly. It's been over 2 months, and this woodworking fantasy hasn't gone anywhere. Margaret looks exhausted all the time. I told you we should have been more direct from the beginning, Eleanor replied. That man is dragging our daughter down with his delusions of being some kind of artist. James would still be interested, you know. He asks about Margaret every time I see him at the firm. She made her choice. Caroline's voice joined. Though I can't imagine why. Did you see that ridiculous train set? Henry could choke on those small pieces. It's only a matter of time before she comes to her senses, Richard said confidently. The money will run out. And then what? She'll see that we were right all along. I've already spoken to Patricia about a position opening up at the foundation, Eleanor added. Perfect for Margaret when she finally leaves him. When, not if, Caroline laughed. Dad's already consulted with Davis about handling the divorce discreetly. I stood frozen, their words cutting through me like shards of glass. They weren't just disapproving, they were actively planning for the end of my marriage, betting on my failure, hoping for it. But the worst realization came when I heard Margaret's voice join the conversation. Could you all please stop? Thomas is right outside. She knew. She was part of this conversation. She hadn't defended me, or expressed outrage at their plotting. She had only worried about me overhearing. In that moment, something broke inside me. A dam that had been holding back years of hurt, rejection, and quiet dignity crumbled. I pushed the shed door fully open, facing the startled group inside. Don't worry about keeping your voices down on my account, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice despite the earthquake happening inside me. I wouldn't want to interrupt the family meeting about my inevitable failure and your daughter's escape plan. Eleanor had the decency to look embarrassed. Caroline examined her manicure while Richard straightened, unapologetic. Thomas and he began, this is a private conversation. About me. About my marriage. I turned to Margaret, whose face had gone pale. How long have you been discussing divorce plans with your family behind my back? I haven't, Thomas. It's not what you think, she stammered. They were just talking. I wasn't part of this. But you knew, I said quietly. You knew they were planning this, hoping for us to fail. Margaret's silence was confirmation enough. Richard stepped forward. Let's be reasonable, Thomas. This little woodworking venture was a nice dream, but it's time to face reality. Margaret deserves security and stability. And you think I can't provide that? Evidence suggests. You cannot, he replied coldly. Your shop is hemorrhaging money. Margaret's been asking her sisters for loans to cover your rent. How long did you think that could continue? I looked at Margaret, the betrayal cutting even deeper. Is that true? Tears welled in her eyes. I was trying to give you more time, she whispered. I believe in you, Thomas, I do, but not enough to be honest with me, I finished for her, not enough to stand up to them. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned and walked away, ignoring Margaret's calls behind me. I moved through the party in a daze, past the celebrating guests who had no idea that my world was collapsing. I drove home alone, Margaret's keys in my pocket. Let her family drive her home. Let them comfort her and tell her how much better off she'd be without me. I was done trying to earn a place at their table. Back at our apartment, I moved methodically, emotions shut down like a circuit breaker that had overloaded. I packed essential clothes, my tools, and the few personal dos, items that truly mattered to me. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter alongside a brief note. I won't be the project your family waits to fail. I deserve better. So do you. By the time Margaret would return, I would be gone. Moved into the small back room of my workshop where a cot and hot plate would become my new home. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A space where no one was waiting for me to fail, where my worth wasn't measured by someone else's yardstick. That night, lying on the narrow cot surrounded by the raw materials and tools of my craft, I made a vow to myself. I would pour every ounce of pain, every moment of rejection, every silent wound into my work. I would transform this breaking point into a turning point. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages and calls from Margaret, which I ignored. Around midnight, a single text came through that I finally read. Please come home. We can fix this. I love you. But some things, once broken, can't simply be glued back together. They must be reimagined, reborn as something entirely new. That's what I understood about wood that the Hartwells never could, that sometimes the most beautiful creations emerge from what appears to be destruction. The next morning, I woke before dawn and began working on a design that had come to me in the fitful hours of half sleep. A desk unlike anything I'd created before, with lines that spoke of both strength and vulnerability, of brokenness and wholeness existing simultaneously. Every cut, every joint, every sanded edge would tell the story of these past years, the story they had never bothered to see. 3 days later, Margaret found me at the workshop. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "You can't just disappear like that," she said, her voice breaking. "We're still married. We still have things to talk about." "I think your family has done enough talking for all of us," I replied, continuing to sand the piece before me. "I'm not my family, Thomas." I finally looked up at her. "Aren't you? When was the last time you stood against them? When was the last time you chose me over their approval?" She had no answer. "I need time," I said finally. "Time to figure out who I am without the weight of their judgment, without trying to prove myself worthy of their respect or your defense." "And us? Our marriage?" I set down my tools. "That depends on you, Margaret. On whether you're willing to see me, really see me, or if you'll always look at me through their eyes." She left without resolution, our future as uncertain as a piece of wood waiting to be shaped. I had no idea what form our relationship would ultimately take, or if it could survive at all. But for the first time since meeting the Hartwells, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The freedom that comes when you stop trying to please those who are determined to find you wanting. What I didn't know then was that this painful separation would spark an unexpected transformation, not just in my work, but in how the world would come to see it. And eventually, how the Hartwells would be forced to see me. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The small back room of my workshop became more than just a temporary shelter. It became a cocoon of transformation. I established a simple routine: wake at dawn, work until my hands ached, fall asleep surrounded by the comforting scent of sawdust and varnish. Margaret and I existed in an undefined space between together and apart. She would visit the workshop occasionally, bringing food or clean clothes. We talked, but never about the future or the past, only the neutral present. It was easier. That way, less painful. I noticed she'd stopped wearing the pearl necklace her mother had given her for our wedding day. "I've taken a new job," she announced during one of her visits, setting down a container of homemade stew. "At the Westfield Design Group. They need someone to manage their client relations." "That's good," I replied, genuinely pleased for her. "You'll be great at that." "It's not the foundation position Mom arranged," she added, a small act of rebellion that didn't go unnoticed. The Davidson commission, the one I'd mentioned to Margaret before our separation, had been completed and delivered. The client, a local restaurant owner, was so impressed that he commissioned 3 more pieces and referred me to friends. Small jobs began to trickle in, nothing substantial, but enough to keep the lights on and food on my table. One rainy Tuesday, a woman walked into my workshop. Elegantly dressed with silver-streaked black hair and piercing eyes, she introduced herself as Diane Mercer. "I've been looking for someone who understands wood," she said, running her fingers along the edge of a coffee table I'd been finishing. Not just how to shape it, but how to honor it. As it turned out, Diane was an interior designer with an impressive client list of wealthy homeowners seeking unique, handcrafted pieces. She had heard about me from the Davidson restaurant and wanted to see my work firsthand. "Most of the artisans I work with are technically proficient but lack soul," she explained, examining a chair I'd recently completed. "Your pieces have both." By the end of her visit, Diane had commissioned a dining set for one of her clients, a project that would cover my expenses for the next 3 months. More importantly, she wanted to feature my work in an upcoming showcase for sustainable luxury design. "Raw talent can only take you so far," she said as she prepared to leave. "You need visibility, connections. My showcase could provide both." After she left, I called Margaret impulsively, wanting to share the news. When she answered, I could hear the smile in her voice as I told her about Diane and the commission. "I knew this would happen for you," she said. It was only a matter of time. Would you want to get dinner tonight? I asked, surprising myself with the invitation. To celebrate? There was a pause. I'd like that, she finally replied. We met at a small Italian restaurant where we'd had our third date years ago. Away from the shadow of her family, Margaret seemed lighter, more like the woman I'd fallen in love with. We talked about her new job, my recent commissions, carefully avoiding the heavier topics that loomed between us. They asked about you, she said eventually, twirling pasta around her fork. My family. At Sunday dinner. I tensed. What did you tell them? The truth. That you're working. That we're... She hesitated, figuring things out. And what did they say to that? Margaret met my eyes. I didn't stay to hear it. I left. It was a small thing, perhaps, but significant. The first real indication that something had shifted in her, too. The weeks leading up to Diane's showcase were a blur of intense work. I selected 3 signature pieces to display. The desk I had designed the night I left our apartment, a rocking chair with flowing lines that seemed to defy gravity, and a small jewelry box with intricate inlay work. Each piece represented a different facet of craftsmanship, but all carried the emotional imprint of recent months. Margaret helped me prepare, coming to the workshop after her workday to assist, with finishing touches and paperwork. We developed a new rhythm, different from our married life but comfortable in its own way. Sometimes, when we worked late into the evening, she would stay on the small pull-out sofa I had added to my makeshift living quarters. We never discussed what it meant, this gradual reconciliation. The night before the showcase, as we were making final preparations, Margaret said quietly, my mother called today, asked if I would be bringing James Peterson to Cousin Vivian's wedding next month. I continued polishing the jewelry box, not looking up. And what did you say? I told her I already had a date. She paused. If you want to be, that is. I finally met her gaze. Is that what you want, Margaret? To bring the embarrassing craftsman husband to face your family again? No, she replied firmly. I want to bring the talented woodworker I married, the man I'm proud of. The showcase was held in a converted warehouse in the Arts District. Diane had transformed the industrial space into an elegant gallery, with each artisan's work displayed in its own thoughtfully designed vignette. My pieces were positioned near a wall of windows, where the natural light highlighted the grain and finish of the wood. I stood nervously beside my display, Margaret at my side in a simple blue dress that matched the inlay of the jewelry box. People began to arrive, designers, architects, potential clients. To my surprise, they lingered at my display, asking questions about technique and materials, expressing admiration for the craftsmanship. Your work has something special, one woman told me, a well-known architect whose projects appeared in design magazines, an emotional quality that's rare in functional pieces. By the end of the evening, I had received commissions for 6 custom pieces and an invitation to contribute to a high-end furniture catalog. Diane was delighted, introducing me to more potential clients and mentioning a possible feature in an upcoming design publication. I told you, she said with satisfaction. All you needed was the right audience. As the event wound down, Margaret squeezed my hand. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. You did this, Thomas. All on your own. It wasn't entirely true. Diane's connections had opened doors that might have remained closed to me otherwise, but I had created the work that walked through those doors. No one could take that away from me. The following weeks brought a steady stream of new clients and projects. I hired an assistant, a recent woodworking school graduate named Mia, to help manage the increased workload. My finances stabilized, then improved. I moved out of the workshop's back room and rented a small apartment nearby. Margaret and I continued our cautious reconciliation. We didn't discuss moving back in together, but we spent most evenings in each other's company. The shadow of her family still loomed, but it seemed less threatening now, less able to touch what was growing between us again. 6 months after Diane's showcase, I received an email that changed everything. The editor of Architectural Digest wanted to feature my work in an article about emerging American craftsmen. The photo shoot would take place in my workshop, focusing on my process as well as the finished pieces. When I called Margaret with the news, she was ecstatic. "Thomas, do you know what this means? You'll be nationally recognized." The day of the photo shoot arrived. The workshop had been carefully arranged to highlight both its working nature and the beauty of the pieces in progress. The photographer, a young woman with an artist's eye, captured images of my hands shaping wood, of sawdust catching light, of the transition from raw material to finished art. The reporter, David, asked thoughtful questions about my influences and techniques. Then, inevitably, "What led you to woodworking? Was it a family tradition?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. No, quite the opposite. My choice to pursue this craft caused significant tension with my wife's family. They saw it as an unsuitable profession, not understanding that working with one's hands can be as dignified and valuable as any office job. David nodded, writing something in his notebook. "And yet you persisted. What gave you that confidence?" I thought of the long, painful journey to this moment. The dinners where I was ignored, the gifts that were dismissed, the whispered conversations about my inevitable failure. "I wouldn't call it confidence," I replied carefully. "More like necessity." There are moments in life when you realize that proving yourself to others is impossible if they're determined not to see your value. You have to decide whether to keep trying or to focus that energy on proving something to yourself instead. When the article was published 3 months later, that quote became the centerpiece, accompanied by stunning photographs of my work and process car. The feature painted a picture of an artisan who had found success by honoring his authentic path despite obstacles. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails from potential clients, interview requests from other publications, and even an invitation to display pieces at a prestigious crafts exhibition in New York. I sent a copy of the magazine to Margaret at her office, with a note that simply said, "None of this would matter without you." That evening, as we celebrated with a bottle of champagne in my workshop, Margaret's phone rang repeatedly. She glanced at it, then silenced it without answering. "Your family?" I asked. She nodded. "They've probably seen the article." "Are you going to call them back?" Margaret set her glass down, looking at me with clear eyes. "No, not tonight. Tonight is about us, about what you've accomplished. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. For the first time, I felt like Margaret was truly choosing me over her family's expectations and demands." The article led to more opportunities: a commission for a conference table for a major corporation, custom pieces for a boutique hotel, even interest from a high-end furniture company about producing a limited line based on my designs. I expanded the workshop, hired 2 more assistants, and began to think about opening a small showroom. Throughout it all, Margaret was my partner and strongest advocate. She helped with the business aspects, organized my increasingly hectic schedule and created a social media presence that further increased visibility for my work. We were building something together, not just a reconciled marriage, but a shared vision for the future. One evening, as we walked home from dinner, Margaret stopped suddenly. "I want us to try again," she said. "Really try. I want to come home, Thomas." Home. The word held so much weight, so much history. "What about your family?" I asked. "They'll never approve." "I don't need their approval anymore," she replied, "and neither do you." The next day, Margaret moved her things back into my new apartment. It wasn't the life we had planned when we first married. It was something different, something we had built from the broken pieces of our old dreams, something stronger. What I didn't realize was that our reconstructed relationship would soon face its greatest test. The Hartwells had been suspiciously quiet since the article was published. I should have known they wouldn't remain silent forever. They were simply regrouping, preparing for one final attempt to reclaim their daughter from the life she had chosen with me. As my professional reputation grew and Margaret and I rebuilt our marriage, a storm was brewing. One that would force a final confrontation with the family that had dismissed me for so long. But this time, When I faced them, I would be standing on a foundation of my own making, with proof they could no longer ignore. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with the Hartwell family crest, a formal request for our presence at Richard and Eleanor's 40th wedding anniversary celebration. Margaret held it delicately, as if it might bite. "We don't have to go," I said, watching her expression carefully. "No, we should," she replied, her voice steady. "It's time." In the years since the Architectural Digest feature, my business had flourished beyond anything I could have imagined. Miller Fine Woodworking now occupied a renovated warehouse with a dedicated showroom section where clients could view completed pieces. I employed 7 craftspeople, including Mia, who had proven herself not just skilled but innovative. We had a 6-month waiting list for custom commissions, and my furniture had been featured in 3 more major publications. Margaret and I had settled into our renewed relationship, stronger for having been broken and mindfully rebuilt. She had advanced at Westfield Design Group to become their client relations director, a position that utilized her natural diplomatic skills and design sensibility. We had purchased a modest but charming craftsman home, which we were slowly renovating ourselves. During this time, Margaret's relationship with her family had been distant but civil. She attended major family events without me, maintaining connections with her sisters while keeping her parents at arm's length. The Hartwells, for their part, had stopped actively undermining our marriage, perhaps recognizing that their daughter was firmly committed to her choice. The anniversary party would be the first time I would face them all together since the disastrous birthday gathering, where I had overheard their plans for our divorce. The thought made my stomach tighten, but I was no longer the insecure craftsman, desperate for their approval. I had built a life and career that spoke for itself. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Margaret asked as we dressed for the party. She looked stunning in a simple navy dress, her only jewelry a wooden pendant I had carved for her last Christmas. "I'm not going for them," I replied, adjusting my tie. "I'm going for you, and maybe a little for myself." The Hartwell estate was exactly as I remembered, imposing, immaculate, designed to impress. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and the sounds of a string quartet drifted from the backyard where a large tent had been erected for the occasion. As we walked up the path, Margaret squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." The party was in full swing when we arrived, the cream of Connecticut society mingling beneath crystal chandeliers hanging from the tent ceiling. I recognized faces from charity galas featured in local magazines, politicians and corporate executives, the world the Hartwells had always wanted Margaret to inhabit. Conversations paused briefly as we entered, a ripple of recognition passing through the crowd. I heard whispers, not of derision, as I might have expected years ago, but of interest. "That's Thomas Miller, the woodworker." "Yes, the one from the magazine. Did you see the piece he created for the Morgans?" Caroline spotted us first, her surprise poorly concealed as she approached. "Margaret, we weren't sure you'd come." Her eyes flicked to me, uncertainty replacing her usual condescension. "Thomas, it's been a while." "It has." I agreed pleasantly. "Congratulations to your parents. 40 years is quite an achievement." Before she could respond, Elizabeth joined us, her manner warmer than I remembered. "Margaret, Thomas, I'm so glad you made it." She surprised me with a brief hug. "I saw your feature in Home and Design last month, Thomas. The dining set you created was exquisite." The genuine compliment caught me off guard. "Thank you, Elizabeth. That's kind of you to say." "Not kind, just truthful," she replied. "Robert and I actually wanted to talk to you about commissioning a piece for our library renovation." Margaret exchanged a look with me, her eyebrows raised slightly in surprise at this unexpected turn. As we moved through the party, the reception continued to defy my expectations. People I'd never met approached to introduce themselves and express admiration for my work. A prominent architect discussed commissioning built-in shelving for a project. The editor of a local lifestyle magazine asked about featuring our home renovation in an upcoming issue. It was surreal, being respected, even sought after, in the very social circle that had once dismissed me. I felt Margaret's pride as she stood beside me, fielding questions and sharing stories of our work together. She was no longer caught between worlds. She had helped create our own. Eventually, the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading arrived. Richard and Eleanor made their way toward us, impeccably dressed and wearing identical expressions of carefully composed politeness. "Margaret, darling." Eleanor embraced her daughter, then nodded to me. "Thomas, thank you for coming." Congratulations on your anniversary," I said, offering the small wrapped package we had brought, a handcrafted photo frame containing a restored image of them from their wedding day, which Margaret had found in an old album. Richard accepted it with a stiff nod. "Margaret tells us your business is doing well." "Very well," I confirmed. "We're expanding the workshop again next month to accommodate the increased demand." "Yes, we've heard about your success," Eleanor said carefully. "The Hendersons mentioned commissioning a piece from you for their summer home." "The sideboard," I nodded. "One of my favorite recent projects." An awkward silence fell. Years of unspoken tension hung between us, too substantial to be dispelled by polite conversation. "Would you excuse us for a moment?" Margaret said suddenly. "I'd like to show Thomas the new rose garden." Without waiting for a response, she led me away from her parents, through the crowd, and out, a side entrance of the tent. The rose garden was beautiful, meticulously maintained with stone pathways winding between blooming bushes. But Margaret didn't pause to admire the flowers. "I'm sorry," she said once we were alone. "I just needed to escape for a minute." "No apology necessary," I assured her. "This is a lot." Margaret sighed, leaning against a stone bench. "They're trying, in their way. Did you notice my mother used your actual name instead of calling you Margaret's husband? That's progress for Eleanor Hartwell." I laughed softly. Baby steps. The thing is," Margaret continued, more serious now, "they haven't changed their minds about us. They've just changed their approach because you've become someone people in their circle respect. It's still about appearances." I didn't expect a heartfelt apology, I admitted. Just being acknowledged as a human being with value is enough for me. "It shouldn't be enough," Margaret said firmly. "You deserve more than that. We both do." We returned to the party in time for the anniversary toast. Richard stood at the center of the tent, champagne flute raised as he thanked their friends for sharing in the celebration of 40 years of building the right kind of life together. His eyes swept over the crowd as he spoke about legacy, thought about creating a foundation for the next generation to build upon. When his gaze landed on us, something flickered across his face, not quite acceptance, but perhaps a reluctant recognition. After the toast, as guests began to depart, James Peterson approached us. I hadn't noticed him earlier in the crowd. "Margaret Thomas," he greeted us with a genuine smile. "Good to see you both." "James," Margaret replied. "Oh, I didn't realize you'd be here." "Richard and I still work together occasionally," he explained. "Plus, these events are good for networking." He turned to me. "I've been following your career with interest, Thomas. Remarkable trajectory." Thank you," I said, somewhat surprised by his sincerity. "Actually," James continued, "I've been meaning to reach out. My firm is renovating our conference spaces, and we're looking for statement pieces that reflect craftsmanship and attention to detail. Would you be interested in discussing a commission?" Before I could respond, Richard appeared beside us, his timing too precise to be coincidental. "James, I see you've found Margaret and Thomas," he said, placing a proprietary hand on James's shoulder. "Just discussing a potential business opportunity," James replied easily. "Thomas's work would be perfect for our boardroom redesign." Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Indeed, Thomas has become quite the success story. The way he said it, as if my success was somehow unexpected or unearned, ignited a familiar spark of anger in my chest. But before it could flare, Margaret spoke up. "Yes, he has," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "Through talent, perseverance, and integrity, despite considerable obstacles." Her pointed look at her father made his nostrils flare, slightly. but he maintained his composure. "We should be going," I said quietly to Margaret, sensing the tension rising. "We have an early meeting tomorrow." As we said our goodbyes, Eleanor approached, her social mask firmly in place. "You must come for dinner soon," she said to Margaret. "Both of you," she added, including me with visible effort. "We have so much to catch up on." "That would be nice," Margaret replied diplomatically. "We'll check our schedules." In the car heading home, Margaret was uncharacteristically quiet. I glanced over to find her staring out the window, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. "Are you okay?" I asked. "They still don't get it," she said finally. "Even now, with all you've accomplished, with all the evidence, right in front of them, they still see you as somehow less than. It's so exhausting." "It doesn't matter what they think anymore," I reminded her. "But it does," she insisted. "Not for us. We're solid. But for them. They're missing out on knowing this amazing person I married because they can't see past their own prejudices." I reached for her hand. "Some people never change, Margaret." "Maybe not," she agreed. "But they can be confronted with their own hypocrisy." A week later, a package arrived at our home, a formal thank you note from Richard and Eleanor for attending their anniversary celebration, accompanied by a check for a substantial amount with a note suggesting it would help with your business expansion. Margaret stared at the check, her expression hardening. "They still think they can control us with money, still think you need their help to succeed." "What do you want to do?" I asked. Her answer was to tear the check in half. "Return to sender," she said firmly. But the Hartwells weren't done with us. The following day, Richard showed up at my workshop unannounced. Mia showed him into my office, her expression clearly communicating that she was aware of who he was and our complicated history. "Impressive operation you have here," Richard said, looking around at the drawings on the walls, the samples of wood and finishes displayed on shelves. "Thank you," I replied cautiously. "What can I do for you, Richard?" He straightened, his already impeccable tie. "I wanted to discuss the commission for James's firm. I sit on their board, you see. James can contact me directly if he's interested," I said. "My assistant can give you a card with our official channels for commission requests." Richard waved this off. "I thought it would be better for us to discuss it man to man, family to family." The implication was clear. He was trying to position himself as a benefactor, a connection I should be grateful for. The old Thomas might have acquiesced, might have been pathetically thankful for this crumb of approval. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I maintain a separate professional process for all clients, regardless of personal connections. It keeps things clean and clear for everyone involved." His face hardened slightly. "I'm trying to help you, Thomas, to extend an olive branch." "Are you?" I asked mildly. "Or are you trying to establish that any success that comes my way is somehow connected to your influence? Because I've built this business without your help, Richard. I don't need your olive branch now." He stared at me for a long moment, reassessing. "Margaret is still a Hartwell," he said finally. "She belongs in our world." "Margaret is her own person," I corrected him, "and she's chosen to create a new world with me. One where people are valued for their character and contributions, not their pedigree or profession." Richard's jaw tightened. "You've turned her against her family." "No," I said firmly. "You did that yourselves, by refusing to respect her choices, by plotting behind her back for our marriage to fail, by treating me as less than human for years." For a moment, Richard looked genuinely startled, as if he'd never considered how his actions appeared from our perspective. Then his expression closed again. "I see this visit was a mistake," he said stiffly. "Not necessarily," I replied. "It depends on what you hope to accomplish. If you came here expecting to establish some kind of authority over me or my business, then yes, it was a mistake. But if you genuinely want to repair your relationship with your daughter, that's something different entirely." He left without another word, his straight back and measured steps betraying his discomfort. I sat at my desk long after he'd gone, wondering if anything would change, if this confrontation would matter at all. That evening, I told Margaret about her father's visit. Instead of the anger I expected, she seemed oddly calm. "It's good," she said. "Good that. You said those things to him directly. He needs to hear them." "I doubt it will change anything," I admitted. Margaret took my hand. "Maybe not, but you stood up to him as an equal, not as someone seeking his approval. That matters, Thomas." The following Sunday, as we were enjoying a lazy morning at home, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, I found Eleanor Hartwell standing on our porch, alone and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside, too surprised to do anything else. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, coffee cup in hand, freezing when she saw her mother. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Eleanor glanced around our home, the woodwork I had carefully restored, the furniture that represented the evolution of my craft, the photographs of our life together displayed proudly on the walls. "Your father told me about his conversation with Thomas," she said finally. "It gave me some things to think about." Margaret and I exchanged a look of cautious surprise. "Would you like some coffee?" Margaret offered. Eleanor nodded, and we moved to the dining area where I had built our table, one of my early pieces, imperfect but loved. "This is beautiful," Eleanor said, running her hand over the table's surface. "You made this, one of my first pieces," I confirmed, "before I had proper tools or training." She nodded, then took a deep breath. "I owe you both an apology, particularly you, Thomas. The way we've treated you has been unworthy of us." The admission hung in the air, remarkable in its unexpectedness. "Why now?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but direct. Eleanor looked down at her hands. "Your father would never admit this, but what Thomas said affected him. And seeing your life here, seeing Thomas's success despite our obstacles, it's forced us to reconsider some things." It wasn't a complete transformation. I could see that Eleanor still struggled with the reality of her daughter's choices. But it was a crack in the wall, a beginning. "We've missed so much of your lives," she continued. "And for what? Pride? Outdated notions about status and suitable professions?" "It wasn't just about my profession," I said quietly. "It was about seeing me as less than, as unworthy of your daughter because I work with my hands." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, and that was wrong, deeply wrong." Margaret reached for my hand across the table, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for saying that, Mom." As Eleanor prepared to leave an hour later, she paused at the door. "Your father and I would like to commission a piece from you, Thomas, something special for our home, if you're willing." It was an olive branch I hadn't expected, not just acknowledgement, but a genuine desire to include my work, and by extension me, in their lives. "I'd be honored," I replied sincerely. After she left, Margaret and I sat in stunned silence for a moment before breaking into relieved laughter. "Did that really just happen?" she asked. "I think it did," I replied, pulling her into my arms. "Though I'm not convinced your father will be quite as gracious." "One step at a time," Margaret said, resting her head on my shoulder. "One step at a time." What neither of us realized then was that Eleanor's visit marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require us to navigate a complex reconciliation with the family that had rejected us for so long. And while the wounds of the past weren't erased, the future held possibilities we hadn't dared to imagine. The proof they could no longer ignore had begun to change things, but the true test was yet to come, when we would all gather for the first time as a family acknowledging each other's worth and choices, when the final confrontation would either heal old wounds or reopen them permanently. 6 months after Eleanor's unexpected visit, I stood in the Hartwells' formal living room, watching as Richard circled the piece I had created for them, a display cabinet of black walnut and maple, designed to showcase Eleanor's collection of antique porcelain. Every detail had been meticulously crafted, from the hand-cut dovetail joints to the subtle inlay work along the crown. The craftsmanship is exceptional, Richard admitted, his finger tracing a section where I had matched the grain patterns perfectly across adjacent doors. I've never seen anything quite like it. Thank you, I replied simply, neither humble nor boastful. This moment had been a long time coming. Richard Hartwell acknowledging the value of my work, standing in his own home. Margaret squeezed my hand, her quiet pride warming me more than any compliment ever could. Over the previous months, we had cautiously rebuilt a relationship with her family. Sunday dinners were no longer battlefields but occasionally tense negotiations of new boundaries and old habits. Eleanor had made the most effort, visiting our home, asking genuine questions about my craft, even attending the opening of my expanded showroom. Richard had been slower to change, maintaining a polite distance while observing our interactions carefully. This commission had been Eleanor's idea, but he had participated in the design discussions, gradually showing more interest as the project progressed. "Where will you place it?" I asked, as Eleanor joined us with glasses of champagne. "Here, I think," she replied, indicating the wall opposite the fireplace, "where everyone can see it when they visit." The significance wasn't lost on me. This wasn't a piece to be hidden away in a rarely used room, but prominently displayed in the heart of their home. A statement to their social circle about their acceptance of my work and, by extension, me. Caroline and her husband arrived as we were discussing the lighting that would best showcase both the cabinet and its contents. She kissed her mother's cheek, nodded to her father, and then, surprisingly, gave me a brief hug. "The photos don't do it justice," she said, admiring the cabinet. "It's stunning, Thomas." Her genuine admiration was yet another marker of how much had changed. Caroline, who had once dismissed my work as a hobby, was now commissioning me to create a custom desk for her home office. Elizabeth and Robert joined us shortly after, completing the family gathering. As we moved to the dining room for dinner, I couldn't help but notice how different this felt from those early meals where I had been effectively invisible, my contributions to conversation ignored or dismissed. "Thomas, tell James about that new technique you're exploring," Eleanor prompted as we began our meal, the one with the steam bending. James Peterson, who had indeed commissioned pieces for his firm's boardroom, listened attentively as I explained the process. The conversation flowed naturally to other topics: Margaret's recent promotion, Elizabeth's son's school achievements, Robert's new sailing hobby. It wasn't perfect. Occasionally, Richard would make a comment that hinted at old prejudices, or Caroline would slip into patronizing tones when discussing creative types. But these moments were fewer and further between, often corrected by a look from Eleanor or a gentle redirection from Margaret. As dessert was served, Richard cleared his throat, commanding the table's attention in that way he had perfected over decades of legal practice and family patriarchy. "I've been doing some thinking," he began, "about traditions and expectations, about the ways we measure success and value." Margaret tensed beside me, preparing for whatever might come next. "When Margaret first introduced Thomas to us," Richard continued, his gaze moving around the table before settling on me, "I made a serious error in judgment. I saw only what he wasn't rather than what he was. I allowed my preconceptions about suitable professions and backgrounds to blind me to his character and talent." The table fell silent, everyone as surprised as I was by this unexpected speech. It took me far too long to recognize that the true measure of a man isn't his pedigree or his profession, but his integrity, his dedication, and his treatment of others. Richard paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I was wrong, Thomas, and I owe you an apology for the years of disrespect and dismissal you endured from me." I felt Margaret's hand find mine under the table, squeezing tightly. This was the moment we had never expected, a genuine, public acknowledgement of the harm done and the responsibility for it. "I appreciate that, Richard," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. "It means a great deal to hear you say that." Richard nodded, then continued with something that shocked me even more. I've been speaking with James about establishing a foundation to support traditional crafts and artisans, a program that would provide grants and mentorship to young people pursuing careers in woodworking, metalsmithing, glass blowing, areas where true craftsmanship is in danger of being lost to mass production. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. This wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of the value of the very work he had once dismissed as a hobby. "We'd like you to serve as an advisor," Richard added, "to help identify promising artisans and guide the foundation's approach." Margaret's grip on my hand tightened, her eyes shining with tears. "Dad, that's incredible." Elizabeth smiled knowingly. "He's been working on this for months, ever since he saw Thomas's feature in American Craftsman." "I had no idea," I said honestly, still processing the magnitude of this gesture. "There was a time when I would have considered your choice of profession a failure," Richard admitted. "Now I see it as something quite different, a preservation of values that our modern world is rapidly losing. Patience, attention to detail, the honor of creating something that will outlive its maker." It wasn't a complete transformation. I could still detect hints of the old Richard, the need to be in control, to reshape the narrative into one where he maintained some authority. But the change was real and substantial. Eleanor raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to family in all its forms." As we clinked glasses, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. The burden of seeking approval from people who had been determined to find me wanting. It wasn't that I suddenly needed or valued their acceptance. Rather, I was freed from the last vestiges of caring whether it came or not. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave, Richard pulled me aside. "There's something else I'd like to show you," he said, leading me to his study. The room was much as I remembered it from those early uncomfortable gatherings. Dark, wood leather-bound books, hunting trophies. But on his desk sat something new. A small, intricately carved box I recognized immediately. It was one of my earliest pieces, a jewelry box I had made for Margaret during our first year of marriage. "Margaret gave this to Eleanor last Christmas," Richard explained. "Said it was time it was properly appreciated." I ran my fingers over the carved surface, remembering the hours spent working on it, the pride I'd felt presenting it to Margaret, and the hurt when her family had barely acknowledged it. "Eleanor keeps her most treasured pieces in it," Richard continued. "Her mother's pearls, the earrings I gave her on our wedding day." The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was powerful nonetheless. My work now contained their family heirlooms, a physical representation of my acceptance into their world. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Richard said, his tone more hesitant than I'd ever heard it. "The pieces you're creating for James's firm, I wonder if you might consider a collaborative approach." "Collaborative?" I echoed, unsure what he meant. "I have some ideas about how the boardroom table might incorporate elements that reflect the firm's history. Perhaps we could discuss them, work together on the concept." It was in its way the ultimate olive branch. Richard Hartwell, who had once considered my work beneath notice, now wanted to contribute to it. Creatively, to be part of something I was building. "I'd be open to that," I said carefully. "Though I should warn you, I can be rather particular about my designs." Richard's laugh was unexpected but genuine. "So I've been told. Margaret says you once scrapped an entire dining table because the grain pattern wasn't exactly what you envisioned." 3 weeks of work," I confirmed with a rueful smile. "But the replacement was better for it." As we rejoined the others, I caught Margaret watching us, her expression a mix of curiosity and hope. I gave her a slight nod, and her smile was worth every difficult moment of the past years. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the evening's events. "Are you okay?" Margaret finally asked as we pulled into our driveway. "I think so," I replied. "It's a lot to take in." She turned to face me. "You know, when we first met, I was running away from their expectations, their plans for my life. I never expected you to become the bridge that would eventually lead me back to them. On my terms. On our terms. Inside our home, our sanctuary built from both our dreams, we settled on the sofa. Margaret curled against my side as we often sat in the evenings. Your father's foundation idea, I said. Do you think it's genuine? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Dad doesn't do things halfway, and he doesn't pretend. Once he changes his mind, he commits fully. It's not about me, I realized aloud. Not really. It's about him recognizing something valuable that he almost missed because of his preconceptions. Margaret nodded against my shoulder. And about making amends in his own way. Dad will never say I was wrong directly, but he'll build an entire foundation to prove he's learned better. We laughed together at the truth of this assessment. 3 months later, the Hartwell Foundation for Traditional Crafts held its inaugural event, a showcase of work by established artisans alongside promising newcomers who would receive the first round of grants. My pieces were featured prominently. But I took more pride in the young craftspeople I had helped identify and mentor. The venue was filled with an eclectic mix of people, the Hartwell's social circle alongside woodworkers with calloused hands, metalworkers in simple clothes, and glassblowers with their distinctive forearm burns, worlds colliding, finding unexpected common ground in appreciation for craftsmanship and quality. I watched as Richard moved through the crowd, as comfortable speaking with a third-generation chairmaker as with the CEO of a multinational corporation. Eleanor led a group of her friends through the exhibition, genuinely enthusiastic as she explained techniques and materials. Margaret appeared at my side, slipping her arm through mine. Happy? She asked. Content, I replied, which felt more accurate. You? Very. She rested her head briefly on my shoulder. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? That night when you walked away from their house, packed your things, and left our apartment? I considered the question. Not specifically this. But I knew something had to change, that I couldn't keep diminishing myself to fit their expectations. You taught me about having the courage to stand up for what matters, Margaret said quietly. Even when it's hard, even when you stand alone. You never let me stand completely alone, I reminded her. Oh, even in the worst times. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with an elderly gentleman who had stopped to admire a display of my latest work, a series of music stands created for a chamber orchestra. Extraordinary balance between form and function, he commented. You don't see craftsmanship like this often anymore. Thank you, I replied. It's a dying art in some ways, but there's a renewed interest among younger woodworkers. Thanks in part to artisans like you who keep the traditions alive, he said. I understand you're working with Richard Hartwell on this foundation. Surprising partnership, I must say. Oh, I kept my tone neutral. Curious about his perspective. Richard has always been rather, shall we say, conventional in his assessments of value. Old Connecticut money, old Connecticut views. The man smiled slightly. It's refreshing to see him embrace something so different from his usual sphere. People can surprise you, I said simply. Indeed they can, he agreed. Although in my experience, it often takes a significant catalyst. Later, as we helped the foundation staff clean up after the event, Richard approached me with 2 glasses of scotch. Successful evening, he said, handing me one. Very, I agreed. The young woman from Vermont, Sarah, the one working with reclaimed barnwood, she's already received 3 commissions from tonight. Richard nodded approvingly. She has promise. Similar sensibility to your early work, but with her own distinct voice. The ease with which he now discussed craftsmanship and artistic perspective was still somewhat startling to me. Why the change of heart, Richard? I asked suddenly, and the question that had been in the back of my mind for months finally surfacing. Really? He considered me for a long moment, then glanced around to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. Do you know what my father did, Thomas? He asked. I shook my head, realizing I had never heard anything about Richard's background beyond his successful law career. He was a watchmaker, had a small shop in Hartford, repaired timepieces, created a few of his own. His hands were always stained with oil, fingernails perpetually darkened. Richard took a sip of his scotch. I was ashamed of him, of his work. I wanted something cleaner, more prestigious. So I went to law school, married well, built a life as far from his workshop as I could get. The revelation stunned me. All this time, Richard's disdain for my work had been rooted in his rejection of his own father's craft. When I saw your pieces in that magazine, he continued, something about the precision, the attention to detail. It reminded me of watching my father work, and I realized that in my determination to be different from him, I had lost something valuable, had nearly cost my daughter her happiness because of my own unresolved issues. This honest vulnerability from Richard Hartwell was perhaps the most surprising development of all. I never knew, I said quietly. Few people do, he replied. Eleanor, of course, but I rarely speak of it. As the evening wound down, Margaret and I said our goodbyes to her family, genuine embraces from Eleanor and Elizabeth, a warm handshake from Richard, even a friendly wave from Caroline, who was deep in conversation with one of the grant recipients. In the car, I told Margaret about Richard's revelation. His father was a watchmaker, she repeated, astonished. He never told me that, never mentioned my grandfather's profession at all, just that he had died before I was born. It explains a lot, I said, about his reaction to me, to my work. Margaret was quiet for a moment. It's sad, really, that he spent so many years running from something that was part of him, and that he nearly denied you the chance to embrace what called to you because of it. She reached for my hand, but he didn't. In the end, we found our way, despite everything. In the weeks and months that followed, our relationship with the Hartwells continued to evolve. There were still occasional tensions, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, but the foundation of respect that had been established held firm. My business continued to thrive, with commissions now extending internationally and a waiting list that stretched nearly a year. Margaret's career flourished as well, her natural talent for building relationships and her eye for design earning. Her a partnership at Westfield. One evening, as we sat in our workshop, Margaret sketching ideas while I finished sanding a table edge, she looked up with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out, she asked, if you had given in, taken the office job my father offered, tried to become what they wanted? I considered the question carefully. I'd have lost myself, I said finally. And eventually, probably you too. We might have had an easier path in some ways, but at what cost? I'm glad you didn't, Margaret said softly. I'm glad you had the courage to walk away that day, to demand better than what they were offering. The irony is that by refusing to accept their terms, I eventually earned the very thing they were withholding, their respect. I set down my sandpaper, but by then, I no longer needed it. And that was the true liberation, not winning the approval I had once so desperately sought, but realizing my worth had never depended on their assessment in the first place. The proof I had returned with wasn't just of my professional success, but of my personal growth, of the strength that comes from honoring your own path, even when others can't or won't see its value. Margaret rose and wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder as she had done countless times over the years. I love you, Thomas Miller. Your stubborn integrity, your patient hands, your unwavering vision. I turned to face her, this woman who had chosen me, chosen us, even when it meant standing against her family's expectations. I love you too. Through all of it, that has been the constant. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I thought about the long journey from those painful Sunday dinners where I was invisible to the man I had become, respected for my craft, secure in my marriage, and at peace with the past. The scars remained, but they had become part of the grain of our lives together, adding character and depth to what we had built. Sometimes the most beautiful creations emerge from what appears to be destruction. As a woodworker, I had always known this truth. Now I had lived it. The rejection that had once defined my relationship with Margaret's family had transformed into something none of us could have predicted. A deeper understanding, a hard-won respect, and ultimately, a kind of healing that acknowledged the past without being bound by it. When I returned to their world, different and bearing proof of my worth, it wasn't for vindication or revenge. It was to close a circle, to make peace with a chapter of our story that had shaped us more profoundly than we had realized. And in that peace, Margaret and I found the freedom to write the rest of our story on our own terms, no longer defined by what we were running from, but by what we were building together.